Last night, I, 32F, discovered that my husband, 37M, had been stalking and manipulating me to get me into a relationship. Hey everyone. Honestly, I don't even know where to start. I'm not really one to post much, but I do scroll through here every now and then when I'm bored. I've been searching online for answers to my situation, but haven't found much that's helpful, so here I am. Never thought I'd be writing something like this, so sorry if it gets long. I'm still trying to sort my thoughts out. Background. I'm 32 and I met my husband, let's call him Dan, who's 37, about 5 years ago. We've been married for a little over 2 years now, and we have a sweet 20-month-old daughter. I'm also 4 months pregnant with our second child. A couple of years ago, we bought a house just outside the city in a quiet suburb. Dan was friends with a co-worker of mine named Mike, so about 5 years ago, I started seeing him more often when we'd all grab drinks after work. To be honest, I wasn't really into him at first. Not that he's unattractive, just not the type I was into back then. Anyway, Dan would always try to chat me up whenever he came around, and it was clear he was interested. I tried to let him down gently, but he kept at it. After one too many drinks one night, I finally agreed to go on a date with him. I remember the date being awkward at first. We'd only ever hung out in a group before, so it was the first time we were one-on-one. Plus, I was hesitant. I almost canceled because I wasn't really into the idea. But my dating life was a mess at the time, I'll get to that later, and I figured I had no other plans. So why not? The start of the date was a bit slow, mostly Dan doing the talking. But eventually, he brought up some stuff I was really into, a hobby of mine and a cause that's close to my heart. The vibe got a lot better from there, and I was surprised to see we had more in common than I thought. I still wasn't sold on him yet, but I decided to give him a shot. Even though he liked me a lot more than I liked him at first, things slowly grew, and before I knew it, I was falling for him. Since then, our relationship has been really good. Dan is my best friend, a wonderful dad, and an all-around great husband. He's also a great provider. When our daughter was born, we decided it would be best for me to quit my job and stay home with her. It wasn't something I was completely on board with at first, but after crunching the numbers, it just made the most sense financially. Despite my initial hesitation, I've really grown to love being home with her. I can't imagine having to miss all these moments. I'm grateful that Dan's hard work allows us to live this way because I know not everyone can afford to live off just one income. I won't get into too many personal details, but Dan works in IT. We're not rich, but we get by comfortably on his salary. We live a modest, middle-class life, and I couldn't ask for much more. Other than the occasional disagreement, our relationship has been solid, and up until last night, I would have said my life was pretty much perfect. The issue. Like a lot of folks, Dan has been working from home since the whole COVID situation started. It took a little getting used to, but it's been fine overall. His job wasn't really affected since he's in IT, but adjusting to the new routine has been the toughest part for him. To keep in touch with friends and coworkers, Dan usually hops on virtual calls once or twice a week. Last night, he was playing some online games with his younger brother, Tom, and a couple of their buddies. Dan doesn't drink often, but since the lockdown, he's been having 2 or 3 beers on these Friday night calls. It's no big deal to me, but last night, he ended up having a few more than usual, and he's not exactly used to drinking that much. After I put our daughter to bed, I checked my phone and saw I had a message from Tom's girlfriend. They've been together for about 1.5 years, and since they live just an hour away, we double date pretty often. I really like Tom and his girlfriend, so I was thrilled when I opened her message and found out they were engaged. It was a group chat, and everyone was flooding it with congratulations. One of Tom's messages stood out where he thanked Dan, saying, "Big thanks to Dan. I wouldn't have made it this far without his advice." I thought it was sweet, like they were looking up to us as some kind of example. I immediately rushed downstairs to talk to Dan about it. I knew he was still gaming with Tom, so he probably knew about the engagement before I did. I plopped down on the couch next to him, and we started chatting about all the details. How long Tom had been planning it, how much the ring set him back, when the wedding might be, all that stuff. Dan was a little tipsy, probably from celebrating his brother's big step, and we were just cuddling on the couch. I mentioned how proud I was of him for being such a great example for Tom, and that's when everything started to unravel. The whole conversation was such a blur that I don't even remember every little detail, but Dan started telling me how he helped Tom get his fiancée to fall for him. I asked him what he meant by that, and that's when he launched into this wild story about how he got me to fall in love with him, something I'd never heard before. He was clearly drunk, spilling this twisted version of how we met, fell in love, and started our relationship. I just sat there in shock, forcing a dumb smile while pretending everything was fine, which probably only encouraged him to keep going. Turns out, according to Dan, he first spotted me on a dating site about 6 months before we ever actually met. He said he messaged me, but I never replied. He looked a bit hurt when he talked about it, but I told him it's just how it is. Women get flooded with messages on those sites, and it's impossible to read or respond to all of them. He insisted that I did read his message but just didn't respond. He went on about how our profiles showed we were a perfect match, shared a lot of the same interests, and how he just knew we'd be great together. After that, he confessed that he created multiple fake profiles using photos of attractive guys he found online. He'd make small tweaks to the pictures so they couldn't be reverse searched. Then he started catfishing me with these profiles, initiating conversations under different identities for a few months. At some point, I must have mentioned where I worked because he said he spent hours scouring Facebook and LinkedIn until he found my profile picture. With my name in hand, he started stalking me hardcore online. He had fake social media profiles, some of which I had accepted as friends or followers, so he had full access to my life. After a few months of this, he started showing up in real life, too. Dan began hanging out at the bar we always went to after work and befriended Mike, my coworker. Mike was a friendly but quiet guy who worked in IT, like Dan. I was always surprised when Mike joined us for happy hour because he mostly kept to himself. Apparently, Dan latched onto Mike and became friends with him just to get closer to me. So when we'd all gather for drinks, Dan started showing up regularly with Mike. It seemed fine because Dan was nice enough, and Mike was more social with him around. This went on for about a month before Dan started hitting on me. Like I said before, he wasn't unattractive, just not my type back then. After a month or two, and with some liquid courage and bad dating luck on my end, I finally agreed to a date. What I didn't know was that my bad luck was orchestrated by Dan's fake profiles. I'd chat with guys I really clicked with, sometimes for weeks, only to get stood up when it was time to meet. It took a serious toll on my self-esteem. One night, after waiting alone for over an hour for a date who never showed, I broke down in my car, feeling like I was the problem. One of the cruelest moments was when I got a text from another one of Dan's fake profiles, accusing me of not looking as good as my photos and calling me the catfish. I was crushed. The very next week at happy hour, I finally gave in and agreed to go out with Dan. It's like he systematically broke me down until I felt desperate enough to say yes. When I asked about all the different phone numbers, he casually told me he'd bought burner phones. I couldn't believe it. And it got worse. What Dan didn't know was that when we first started dating, I was also talking to someone else. I wasn't that into Dan at first, so when this incredibly good-looking guy messaged me on the dating site, I couldn't resist chatting with him. After all the letdowns, I was cautious, but I kept the conversations going with Alex while still seeing Dan. I wasn't ready to commit to Dan unless I was sure Alex wasn't just another jerk. So, Alex and I went on our first date, and it was amazing, until the very end. Things started off on a high note. He actually showed up, which was already a win considering my recent luck, and he was even better looking in person. I couldn't believe someone like him was genuinely interested in me. At that point, my confidence was at rock bottom. We clicked instantly, talking, laughing, and gazing into each other's eyes. I remember my heart racing, and I felt those butterflies in my stomach that I hadn't felt in forever. It honestly felt like love at first sight, like something straight out of a movie. We had a couple of glasses of wine, just enough to feel relaxed, but definitely not drunk. When we left the bar, we ended up making out a bit in the back of the parking lot. I felt so alive in that moment, like maybe I'd finally found the guy I'd been searching for. It had been a long time since I felt that kind of spark with anyone, and I let the moment sweep me away, so I invited Alex to come back to my place. But I'll never forget how his expression completely changed. His warm blue eyes turned cold, and he stiffened up. He took a step back, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Sorry, I'm not into sluts," before turning around and walking away. It was like a punch to the gut. I never would have expected that after the night we'd shared, and I just stood there, stunned. I thought it was some kind of sick joke, but he didn't look back. I waited, but when it was clear he wasn't coming back, I broke down completely. My stomach twisted in knots and I couldn't breathe. I was sobbing uncontrollably. I have no idea if anyone saw me or not, but nobody said a word. I cried until there were no tears left, then finally pulled myself together and walked home, feeling completely crushed. That night, I had some really dark thoughts. I kept beating myself up, thinking I'd ruined what I thought was my one shot at real love. Honestly, even after I got married, I couldn't help but think about Alex. He was always the one that got away, and I blamed myself for years. For context, I should mention that the night I went out with Alex, I had actually canceled plans with Dan. When Dan texted the next day asking me to go mini-golfing, I jumped at the chance. Looking back, I think I clung to Dan after that night, and our so-called fairy tale relationship really grew from that point on. So why does this matter? Last night, while Dan was bragging, almost proudly, about all the things he did to be with me, he let slip that he had even paid a guy to go out with me. When I pressed for more details, he casually admitted that Alex was someone he had paid to date me. The plan was for Alex to take me out a few times and then blow me off, presumably to mess with my self-esteem. I was completely floored. I never told Dan about Alex. We only exchanged messages for a couple of weeks and went on one date. I didn't want Dan to know I had been seeing other guys when we first started dating, so I kept it to myself. But hearing him casually recount it made it all too real. Dan seemed to find the whole thing amusing as he explained how he'd found Alex, a broke aspiring model living a couple of hours away. He offered to pay him to set up a profile, chat with me, and go on a few dates, only to turn into a jerk and stop seeing me. According to Dan, it was supposed to teach me to appreciate what I had instead of chasing some fantasy. But Alex saw an opportunity when I invited him home and took his chance. When I asked Dan why he'd orchestrate something so cruel, he said I was just a silly girl chasing guys out of my league and needed a reality check to see that the right guy for me was right in front of me. Up until then, I'd been smiling and half laughing at the ridiculousness of it all, probably encouraging him to keep talking. But the story about Alex hit me hard. I had a panic attack after that night with Alex, and I honestly don't think my self-esteem ever fully recovered. I asked Dan how much he paid Alex, and he just shrugged and said it was $1,000. Now, after Dan confessed about Alex, I just went upstairs and went to bed. Dan, meanwhile, had a few more beers and passed out on the couch. This morning, he's nursing one of the worst hangovers I've ever seen him have, and I don't even know how to bring it up. Part of me wants to ask if it was all true, but deep down, I know it was. He knew too many details to be making it up. Plus, with the state he's in, I doubt he'd remember much from last night anyway. I feel completely lost. Everything I thought I knew about our relationship feels shattered. I used to think we had this amazing love story, but now it just feels twisted. I hate to admit it, but there's this strange part of me that's also a little flattered. Dan's not the kind of guy who plans much of anything, let alone something this elaborate. The effort he put into getting me, as creepy as it was, also feels weirdly romantic. But maybe that's just me grasping at straws? I don't want to talk to my friends or family about this because it's just too bizarre, so I'm turning to you all. I'm hoping for some outside perspective. Is this even remotely normal? Have any of you experienced anything like this? Guys, have you ever manipulated events to this degree just to be with someone? Ladies, has your man ever done something crazy to get you? Up until last night, I had a wonderful husband, a beautiful family, and a life that most people would envy. Nothing has technically changed except my understanding of how we got here. Do I even bring this up again? Do I just accept that my husband went to great and disturbing lengths to be with me and try to move on? Or should I be talking to a therapist? I feel completely lost and don't know what my next step should be, if there even is one.